They called her Grandma behind her back. Sometimes, when he was feeling particularly cruel, Dr. Preston Sterling would call her Dusty, not knowing the name's true origin, just that it sounded old and useless, like something you'd wipe off a forgotten shelf. He'd actually placed a $500 bet in the nurses' station that Sarah Miller wouldn't last another month at Mercy General Hospital. The younger nurses, like Brittany Moore, would giggle nervously, their eyes flicking between Sterling's polished, arrogant smirk and Sarah's quiet, unassuming form. They saw a woman in her late 40s, small and wiry, with greying blonde hair pulled back in a severe, unfashionable bun. They saw oversized scrubs that hung on her frame, making her look even more fragile than she was. Most of all, they saw her hands. Her hands had a faint, rhythmic tremor, a slight but constant vibration that Sterling loved to point out during rounds. "Grandma, are we sure we can trust you with that IV?" he'd say, his voice booming with false concern. "We wouldn't want a little shake to turn into a big mistake." Sarah never responded to the taunts. She would just give a small, almost imperceptible nod, her pale blue eyes focused on the chart, the monitor, the patient. She moved with a deliberate, plodding pace that drove the residents mad. They saw slowness. They didn't see the economy of motion, the way she never took a wasted step. They heard her quiet, raspy voice and assumed weakness. They didn't know it had been shredded by years of shouting over the roar of helicopter rotors and the cacophony of battle. They saw a tired, broken-down floor nurse who was past her prime, a charity case the hospital was forced to keep on for reasons no one understood. She was a ghost in the hallways, easy to ignore, easier to mock. The security camera footage from that Tuesday night, just as the witching hour began its grim crawl toward dawn, captured the exact moment the world at Mercy General shattered. 1 second, it was the familiar, exhausted hum of a late-night shift in a busy Chicago trauma center, the rhythmic beep of monitors, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the low murmur of conversations. The next, the entire building seemed to vibrate. It was a sound before it was a feeling, a deep, guttural thwop, 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 that grew from a distant thrum to a deafening roar, that pressed against the windows and rattled the instruments on their steel trays. Then, the code black alarm didn't just ring, it screamed. A piercing, cyclical shriek that cut through the air and sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through every soul in the building. In the chaos that followed, as Dr. Sterling froze, his handsome face a mask of confusion and panic, a single, raspy voice cut through the noise. It wasn't loud, but it carried the chilling weight of absolute authority. "Look at his neck, you idiot! He can't breathe!" They took her ID badge, her stethoscope, and her dignity, handed her a soggy cardboard box, and told her she was finished. After 25 years of saving lives in the worst places on earth, Sarah Miller was fired for insubordination and assault. Standing under a flickering bus stop light in the freezing Chicago rain, she thought her life was over. She was wrong. Her real life was just about to be revealed to the world. Dr. Preston Sterling enjoyed the theatre of the emergency room. He saw it as his personal stage, and he was its undisputed star. Tall, with the sharp jawline of a movie star and an ego to match, he moved through the trauma bays with the unearned confidence of a man who had never truly failed at anything. His white coat was always pristine, a stark contrast to the blood and grime of the work, and he wore his stethoscope draped around his neck like a piece of expensive jewelry, not a tool. He was the son of Senator Huntington, a man whose name was literally carved into the stone of the hospital's newest wing. Preston never let anyone forget it. He'd check his gleaming Rolex with an exaggerated sigh when a nurse was too slow, name-drop his father's powerful connections in casual conversation, and treat the support staff like a collection of inconvenient, slow-moving servants. Sarah Miller was his favorite target. She was the antithesis of everything he valued. She was old, quiet, and physically unimpressive. Her deference, her refusal to engage with his provocations, infuriated him. He interpreted her quiet professionalism as weakness, her meticulous double-checking of charts as a sign of impending dementia. The tremor in her hands was the punchline to all his jokes. "Let's have Nurse Miller restock the saline bags," he'd announced loudly, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "It's good physical therapy for those shaky hands." The younger staff, desperate to stay in his good graces, would either laugh along or pointedly look away, their silence a form of complicity. Brittany Moore, a bright but timid nurse barely a year out of school, was one of them. She admired Sarah's calm but was terrified of Sterling's wrath. So she kept her head down and her mouth shut. The charge nurse, Brenda O'Brien, was a different story. A woman in her 50s with arms like a dock worker and a face that looked like it was carved from granite, Brenda had seen everything. She'd survived pandemics, budget cuts, and generations of arrogant residents like Sterling. She had zero patience for incompetence, regardless of a person's surname. While she was publicly harsh with everyone, demanding perfection, she watched Sarah with a skeptical but discerning eye. She saw the tremor, yes, but she also saw that Sarah's hands were rock steady when she was starting a difficult IV on a dehydrated patient. She saw the slow walk, but she also saw that Sarah was always the first to notice a subtle change in a patient's breathing or a slight dip in their oxygen saturation. Brenda didn't like Sarah, not personally, but she was beginning to respect the work. It was a quiet, grudging respect she kept to herself. "Miller, did you check the expiration dates on the intubation tray?" Sterling's voice cut through the ER din one afternoon. "Yes, doctor," Sarah replied without looking up from the monitor she was calibrating. "I checked them this morning." "Check them again," he commanded, not as a request, but as a power play. He wanted everyone to see him order her to do a menial, redundant task. "We can't have our patients dying because Grandma forgot how to read a label. It's a simple matter of protocol." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, her movements deliberate as she walked over to the crash cart, pulled out the tray, and began inspecting each item, her back to him. Sterling winked at Brittany, who quickly busied herself with the chart, her cheeks flushing with shame. Big Mike, the security guard stationed near the ambulance bay doors, saw the whole exchange. A mountain of a man in his early 60s, Mike had a gentle nature that belied his imposing size. He saw the cruelty in Sterling's games and the quiet dignity in Sarah's endurance. He just shook his head slowly and went back to watching the doors, a grim set to his mouth. The injustice simmered. It was in the air, a toxic miasma of fear and resentment. Sterling was untouchable, a prince in his father's kingdom, and Sarah was just an old nurse, a ghost waiting to be exorcised. He'd made his bet public, writing, $500, Miller is gone by the 1st, on the break room whiteboard. It was a constant, glaring reminder of her precarious position. She was alone, underestimated, and, in the eyes of the man in charge, utterly disposable. If you're already hooked by this story of justice, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It really helps us share more stories of everyday heroes who refuse to back down. Now, back to Sarah Miller's story, because what happened next changed everything. Tuesday night bled into Wednesday morning. The city outside was quiet, draped in a cold, miserable rain that slicked the streets and blurred the lights into impressionistic streaks. Inside Mercy General's trauma unit, the fluorescent lights hummed with an aggressive, sterile brightness. It was 2 a.m., the witching hour, when the city's ghosts came out to play. The ER was holding its breath, caught in a lull between the evening's alcohol-fueled brawls and the pre-dawn heart attacks. Sarah was methodically charting, her bad knee, a souvenir from a long-forgotten fall, giving a dull throb in time with the slow drip of an IV bag. Brenda was barking orders at a resident who'd misplaced a patient's labs. Sterling was leaning against the main counter, scrolling through his phone, looking bored and immaculate. Then came the sound. It wasn't a siren. It was a feeling first, a low-frequency vibration that resonated up through the concrete floor. Puddles in the parking lot shivered. The glass in the bay doors rattled in their frames. It was a deep, guttural thrumming that grew exponentially, a sound that didn't belong in the heart of downtown Chicago. Thwop, thwop, thwop. The noise pressed in on the building, a physical weight against the chest. Everyone froze. Heads lifted. Conversations died.
"What the hell is that?"
a resident whispered, his eyes wide. Big Mike was already moving toward the doors, his hand instinctively going to the radio on his hip. Through the rain-streaked glass they could see it. A Black Hawk helicopter, a monstrous olive-drab insect of war, was descending. Not on the rooftop helipad. It was landing in the middle of the damn street, its rotors whipping the rain into a furious vortex, sending trash cans rolling and peeling the awnings off the storefronts across the way. Its landing lights cut through the gloom like alien suns. Before the helicopter's skids even touched the asphalt, 2 black SUVs screeched to a halt, boxing in the ambulance bay entrance. Men in dark suits and earpieces spilled out, their movements sharp and economical, their eyes scanning everything, assessing every threat. Then the alarm went off. It wasn't the familiar chime of a code blue. It was a sound few in that hospital had ever heard outside of a drill. The code black alarm. It didn't ring, it screamed. A high-pitched, frantic wail that signaled a mass casualty event or a situation of extreme, overwhelming threat. Code black! Code black! Trauma Bay 1, ETA 0 minutes. This is not a drill! A voice crackled over the intercom, tight with panic. The atmosphere in the ER shifted from exhaustion to electric chaos. Nurses and doctors scrambled. Sterling, for a moment, looked utterly lost, his phone forgotten in his hand. The prince had never seen a real dragon. The ambulance bay doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the hall. They weren't opened. They were thrown aside by 2 uniformed military police officers, rifles held at a low ready. Between them, paramedics frantically pushed a gurney, a young medic straddling the patient, manually bagging him, his face a mask of desperate concentration. Multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen. BP is 60 over palp. Heart rate 140 and thready. He's been losing pressure for 20 minutes. The patient on the gurney was a large man, built like a fortress, his face pale and beaded with sweat under a layer of grime and blood. A mess of field dressings, already soaked through with dark crimson, covered his torso. Sterling finally snapped into motion, his training kicking in, but it was colored by his arrogance. He strode forward, puffing out his chest, asserting his authority in the face of the military intrusion. "I am Dr. Sterling, Chief of Surgery. Get him into Bay 1 now. I need a full GCS. Get me 2 large-bore IVs, type O-neg blood on the warmer, and someone get a chest tube tray ready," he barked, his voice a little too loud, a little too shrill. He was performing. They swarmed the patient in Trauma Bay 1. The room became a blur of motion and shouting. Vitals were called out, a chaotic symphony of deteriorating numbers. "Pressure's dropping, 50 over palp. Sats are down to 82 and falling." Sterling, focused on the most dramatic injuries, began ripping away the blood-soaked dressings on the man's abdomen. "I see the bleeders. Get me lap pads. Suction, now. We need to pack these and get him to the OR." He was focused on the holes, the obvious textbook trauma. But Sarah, standing at the edge of the controlled storm, saw something else. She wasn't looking at the blood. She was looking at the patient's neck. Her eyes, trained by thousands of similar scenes in dusty, makeshift operating tents, saw the subtle but terrifying signs Sterling was missing. The patient's neck veins were distended, bulging like thick cords. His trachea, the faint ridge of his windpipe, wasn't in the center of his neck. It was shifted, pushed almost 3 centimeters to the left. And when she put her hand on his upper chest, she felt it. A crackling, like Rice Krispies under the skin. Subcutaneous emphysema. His chest wasn't rising and falling evenly. The right side was still, while the left heaved desperately. He wasn't dying from the holes in his belly. He was dying from the air filling his chest cavity, crushing his lung and heart. A tension pneumothorax. He had seconds, not minutes. She moved forward, her voice low but urgent. "Dr. Sterling." He ignored her, barking orders for more blood. "Hang 2 more units! I'm not losing him to hypovolemia." "Doctor," she repeated, her voice sharper now. She was at his elbow. "Look at his neck. His trachea is deviated. There are no breath sounds on the right side. It's a tension pneumo." Sterling whipped his head around, his face contorted with fury at being questioned in his own theater. His eyes blazed. "Silence, nurse!" he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. The entire room fell quiet, the shouting stopping for a heartbeat. Everyone turned to watch the confrontation. "Are your eyes as shaky as your hands?" "I am the chief of surgery here. I have identified the primary bleed. Now get out of my way or I will have you removed." He gestured dismissively toward a sucking chest wound, a gruesome but less immediately fatal injury. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong, and his pride wouldn't let him see it. At that exact moment, the patient's monitor let out a single, long, continuous shriek. The heart rate line went from a frantic scribble to a slow, dying wave, then flatlined. Flatline. The patient's body convulsed once. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his lips, already tinged with blue, turned a deep, horrifying violet. "He's coding! Starting compressions!" a resident yelled, scrambling to get on the gurney. Sterling stood frozen for a full, fatal second. His face went slack, the color draining from it. The bravado, the arrogance, it all shattered, revealing the terrified, incompetent man beneath. He was paralyzed. The prince had no idea what to do. In that frozen moment, Sarah Miller made a choice. She looked at the dying soldier on the table, a man who could have been any one of the hundreds she'd fought to save. She looked at the arrogant, useless doctor who was about to let him die, and she thought of her oath. Not the hospital's policy, not the chain of command, but the oath she had taken to preserve life, no matter the cost. Her career for his life. It was no choice at all. She didn't run, she didn't scramble. She moved. The slow, deliberate nurse was gone, replaced by something else entirely. She moved with a terrifying, fluid precision, an explosive efficiency that seemed impossible for her small frame. She didn't go to the scrub line. She bypassed it, her hand darting out to a secondary tray, grabbing a 14-gauge angiocath, the long, thick needle used for starting major IVs. It was a motion she had performed 1,000 times in the back of bucking Blackhawks and the dust-choked ruins of Fallujah.
What do you think you're doing?
Sterling finally sputtered, snapping out of his stupor. He saw her with the needle and lunged to stop her. "That's not protocol! Security! Restrain her!" Sarah didn't even look at him. As he reached for her arm, she dipped her shoulder, pivoted on her back foot, and met his forward momentum with a rigid elbow to his sternum. It wasn't a push. It was a tactical block, a move designed to stop a threat with minimal effort and maximum effect. Sterling, all 190 pounds of him, stumbled backward with a grunt of pain and surprise, tripping over a discarded saline bag and crashing onto the floor. The sound of the chief of surgery hitting the deck echoed in the stunned silence. Sarah was already at the patient's side. She ignored the resident preparing to start compressions. "Stop," she commanded, her voice a whip-crack of authority. The resident froze, his hands hovering over the patient's chest. Sarah placed her left hand on the soldier's chest, her fingers probing with an unnerving certainty. She wasn't guessing. She was finding the landmark. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Right there. She could feel the notch between the ribs, even through the swelling. She took the 14-gauge needle, held it perpendicular to the chest wall, and without a moment's hesitation, she pushed. The needle sank into the flesh, past the muscle, and popped through the pleura. Hiss! The sound was shockingly loud in the silent room. It was the sound of a tire being punctured, the audible, forceful escape of trapped, high-pressure air. The patient's chest, which had been unnaturally puffed out on the right side, visibly deflated. On the monitor, the flat line broke. A single, weak beat appeared. Then another. Then a rhythm. Slow, but it was there. The oxygen saturation numbers, which had been a terrifying blank, flickered to life. 70, 75, 85, 92, 98. The deep violet of the soldier's lips faded to purple, then to a pale, blessed pink. He took a huge, shuddering, gasping breath, the most beautiful sound in the world. Sarah secured the catheter in place with a piece of tape from her pocket, her movements economical and sure. She stepped back from the table, her job done. The entire event, from Sterling's fall to the patient's first breath, had taken less than 10 seconds. The room was deathly silent. The only sound was the now steady, rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. The resident stared at her, his mouth hanging open. Brenda O'Brien, the charge nurse, looked as if she had just seen Sarah grow a second head. Brittany Moore had her hands clapped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Sterling scrambled to his feet, his pristine white coat now smudged with floor grime, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage. "You're finished!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "You assaulted me! You performed a procedure you are not qualified for. You are fired. I will have your license. Security, get her out of here." But before Big Mike or anyone else could move, a weak, raspy voice came from the gurney. The patient, the Navy SEAL commander, had his eyes open. They weren't looking at the doctor who was screaming. They were fixed on Sarah. He slowly, painfully, lifted a shaking hand, not in a wave, but with his fingers held stiffly together. He brought it to his brow in a formal, lingering salute, a salute of absolute, profound respect. Through the clear plastic of the oxygen mask, he whispered a single word, a name no one in that room had ever heard. "Dusty?" The adrenaline that had flooded Sarah's system, turning her into a machine of pure competence, began to recede. The tremor returned to her hands, more pronounced now. She looked at the soldier, this stranger who knew her by a name from another life, and saw the recognition in his eyes. He didn't see an old nurse. He saw a legend he'd only heard stories about. She gave him a small, weary nod. Her voice was quiet again, the raspy calm returning. "At ease, sailor," she said. "Let us work." She turned, peeled off her gloves, and dropped them in the biohazard bin. The standoff was over. The patient was alive. And her life, she knew, was ruined. Incredible, right? If you want to see more stories where the underdog becomes the hero, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell. Also, comment below with your best guess about what happens to Dr. Sterling, because trust me, his downfall is going to be spectacular. Let's continue. The aftermath was swift and brutal. While a team of stunned but newly competent doctors, now correctly treating the patient under Brenda's watchful glare, wheeled the stabilized SEAL commander to the OR, Sterling was on the phone. He wasn't speaking to hospital security. He was speaking to Harold Pemberton, the hospital administrator, and his voice was a low, controlled snarl of fury and entitlement. Less than 30 minutes later, Sarah was summoned to the administrative conference room on the top floor. The room was the opposite of the ER's chaotic functionality. It was all polished mahogany, plush leather chairs, and a panoramic view of the rainy city skyline. It was a room designed for power and intimidation. Seated at the long table were 3 people: Harold Pemberton, a nervous, sweating man in his 50s who looked perpetually worried about liability, a stone-faced HR director holding a file, and Dr. Preston Sterling. Sterling had changed into a clean white coat. His hair was perfectly combed. He sat with a posture of aggrieved victimhood, a slight, almost imperceptible bruise beginning to form on his chest, which he touched occasionally, as if in great pain. Sarah stood before them, alone. She was still in her scrubs, a small smudge of the seal's blood on her sleeve. She felt tired, her bad knee aching from the damp cold. "Sarah," Pemberton began, avoiding her eyes and wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "We have a very, very serious situation here. Dr. Sterling has informed us that you physically assaulted him and performed a dangerous, unauthorized medical procedure on a high-value patient, directly contravening his orders as chief of surgery." Sterling leaned forward. "She could have killed him," he said, his voice smooth and filled with rehearsed gravity. "She punctured his lung. It was a reckless, desperate act of a clearly unstable individual. I was in the process of stabilizing the patient's abdominal bleeding, the clear and present danger, when she attacked me. I managed to correct her mistake and stabilize the patient for surgery, but her actions put his life in grave jeopardy." He was building his narrative, brick by brick, lie by lie. The HR director opened her file and began to read in a cold monotone. "Gross misconduct, insubordination, physical assault on an attending physician, violation of chain of command protocols, reckless endangerment." Each charge was a nail in the coffin of her career. Sarah didn't defend herself. What was the point? It was her word against the son of the man who owned the building. She just stood there, her hands clasped behind her back to hide the tremor. She looked at Sterling, at his perfect suit and his perfect lies. "The patient is stable, isn't he?" she asked, her voice a quiet rasp. Pemberton flinched. "That is beside the point, Sarah. The point is protocol. The point is order. We cannot have nurses, especially nurses with your record of performance issues, taking matters into their own hands." "So you're firing me," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Effective immediately. Your employment at Mercy General is terminated," the HR director confirmed, sliding a form across the table. "We'll be reporting this incident to the State Nursing Board." Her license. They were going after her license. That was it. The end of everything. 2 decades of service, a lifetime of knowledge, all erased by one arrogant boy's bruised ego. She felt a profound weariness settle into her bones. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just nodded. "Fine," she said. She turned to leave. "One more thing," Sterling said, a triumphant smirk finally breaking through his somber facade. "Security will escort you to your locker and then off the premises. You are not to speak to any staff. You are not to re-enter this building." The walk of shame was a lonely, surreal journey. Big Mike was waiting for her outside the conference room, his face a picture of misery. He was the one tasked with escorting her out. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he mumbled as they walked the long, sterile hallway toward the locker room. "This isn't right. None of it." "It's okay, Mike," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "Watch that blood pressure of yours. Don't let these people get to you." Other nurses and staff saw them. They averted their eyes, pretending to be busy with charts or conversations. They knew what was happening. They knew it was unjust. But they also knew that if they spoke up, they would be next. Their silence was the price of their own survival. Sarah cleaned out her locker. It didn't take long. There wasn't much. A cracked coffee mug that said, "World's okayest nurse." A well-worn pair of trauma shears she'd bought with her own money. A small, dying succulent plant someone had given her. And at the very back, a small framed photo of her late husband, David, in his army dress uniform. She carefully wrapped the photo in a spare scrub top and placed it in the cardboard box Mike had brought for her. 2 decades of her life, reduced to a collection of trinkets that wouldn't even fill the passenger seat of a car. Mike walked her to the main entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing the dark, rain-soaked street. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he said, his voice thick. She stepped out into the cold. The doors slid shut behind her. It was over. She didn't have a car. She couldn't afford the repairs on her old sedan. So she walked the 6 blocks to the bus stop, the freezing rain plastering her thin hair to her forehead and soaking through her light jacket. The cardboard box grew heavier with each step, its corners softening and threatening to give way. The weight of it was more than physical. It was the weight of failure, of injustice, of a life dismantled. She huddled under the flimsy shelter of the bus stop, shivering. She looked at her reflection in the dark, rain-streaked glass. She just saw a tired old woman, a failure. Maybe Sterling was right. Maybe she was just an incompetent old nurse who didn't know her place. The thought wasn't angry. It was a heavy, suffocating fact. He would press charges. The police would get involved. She'd lose her certification. She'd end up greeting customers at a big box store, if she was lucky. No one would ever know what she had done, who she had been. Her hands, now free from the need to be steady, shook violently from the adrenaline dump and the profound, soul-crushing defeat. She clutched the box tighter, trying to shield the photo of David from the damp. The rhythmic throb in her bad knee felt like a mocking drumbeat, counting out the seconds of her new, empty life. And then she heard it again, that same sound. Thwop, thwop, thwop. She looked up, her heart lurching. It wasn't 1 helicopter this time. It was 3. They tore through the low-hanging clouds like vengeful gods, their searchlights cutting through the downpour. They weren't heading for the hospital. They were heading for her. Tires screeched. The intersection a block away was suddenly blocked by the same black SUVs, positioned sideways to stop all traffic. Cars slammed on their brakes, causing a small pile-up. Pedestrians scattered, screaming, assuming it was a terrorist attack. The downdraft from the lead helicopter hit the street with the force of a hurricane, inverting umbrellas and sending debris swirling. The ground itself seemed to shake. The lead Black Hawk didn't circle. With impossible precision, it landed right in the middle of the intersection, its rotors still spinning furiously. The side door slid open. Men in full combat gear, not MPs this time, but operators in tactical black, repelled to the ground. They fanned out, creating a perimeter, their rifles scanning the crowd that was beginning to form. From the second helicopter, a ramp lowered. A figure emerged, walking calmly into the rotor wash and the driving rain, as if it didn't dare touch him. He wasn't in uniform, but in a simple windbreaker and jeans. He carried a thin black cane, but he didn't lean on it. He wielded it. He was flanked by 2 men in suits, but his presence alone filled the entire street. Even from a distance, the 4 silver stars on the collar of his windbreaker gleamed in the chaotic wash of emergency lights. One of the soldiers on the ground pointed directly at the bus stop. At her. "Target acquired. In the rear." Before she could process what was happening, one of the operators broke from the perimeter, and started sprinting through the stalled traffic, dodging cars, his boots splashing through the deep puddles. He was at her side in seconds, his face grim, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "you need to come with us, now." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not rough. What is this?" Sarah stammered, clutching her box. "Drop the box, ma'am. We have to go." "No," she said, a flicker of her old defiance returning. "The box comes with me." The soldier didn't argue. He simply nodded, took the soggy box from her, and tucked it under his other arm as if it were a priceless artifact. "This way, ma'am." He led her through the chaos toward the waiting general. As she approached, the four-star general's stern face broke into a small, weary smile. He looked her up and down, taking in the wet hair, the shivering frame, the look of utter bewilderment on her face. "You are a hard woman to track down, Dusty," said Lieutenant General Thompson, commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. "You look like hell." "You should see the other guy," she rasped, a ghost of a smile touching her own lips. "I've heard," the general said, his smile fading. "Commander Phillips is stable. He's asking for you. He told us what happened. He also told us who you are." He gestured toward the waiting helicopter. "We have a press conference to interrupt." The walk back into Mercy General was the polar opposite of her walk out. This time she was flanked by a four-star general and a squad of the most elite soldiers on the planet. The hospital lobby was a circus. News crews had materialized, their cameras aimed at a makeshift podium where Dr. Preston Sterling was holding court. He was in his element, his voice smooth and confident, painting a picture of his own heroism. "It was a tense situation, to be sure," Sterling was saying to the reporters, his face a perfect mask of humble authority. "The patient presented with multiple traumatic injuries, and my team and I worked quickly to stabilize him. There was a minor complication, an issue with a confused but well-meaning nurse who unfortunately is no longer with us. But we were able to overcome that and perform the life-saving procedure. The commander is now in stable condition thanks to the quick actions of my surgical team." The automatic doors slid open. The entire lobby fell silent. The reporters, the hospital staff, everyone turned. The sight was surreal. A four-star general, a squad of armed soldiers, and the small, soaking wet nurse who had been fired less than an hour ago. General Thompson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence sucked all the air out of the room. He walked directly toward the podium, his cane tapping a steady, ominous rhythm on the polished floor. Clack, clack, clack. Sterling's confident smirk faltered. His eyes widened in disbelief and then narrowed in confusion. "General," he stammered, trying to recover. "This is a private hospital matter. I must ask you to—" "I was just watching your press conference on the ride over, Doctor," General Thompson said, his voice dangerously calm. The cameras all swung from Sterling to him. "It was fascinating. You just told the nation that your team saved Commander Phillips. You also mentioned a confused nurse." He stopped directly in front of Sterling, his eyes like chips of ice. He turned his head slightly to look at Sarah, then back at Sterling. "This nurse?" Sterling's face went pale. She was unstable. She assaulted me. She put the patient at risk." "That's not what the commander says," the general replied smoothly. "And it's not what the security footage shows." He gestured to one of his aides, who stepped forward with a tablet. "But before we get to that, let's correct the record on a few things." The general turned to face the cameras. From inside his jacket, he pulled a slim black folder with the words "Classified" stamped across it in red. He opened it. "You all see this woman, Sarah Miller, and you see a nurse," he began, his voice ringing with authority. "Let me tell you who I see." He looked down at the file, though he didn't need to read it. He knew it by heart. I see Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller, retired, United States Army Medical Corps. I see one of the most decorated trauma surgeons to ever serve in Joint Special Operations Command. I see a veteran of 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, embedded with the 75th Ranger Regiment and Delta Force, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross for running a field hospital single-handedly for 72 hours under direct enemy fire in the Kunar province, recipient of the Silver Star for performing a 6-hour open-heart surgery in the back of a crashing helicopter, recipient of the Bronze Star with Valor, recipient of 2 Purple Hearts. A collective gasp went through the room. Sterling looked like he had been punched in the gut. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The general continued, his voice rising with cold fury. Her unit had a nickname for her. They called her Dusty, because during a sandstorm in Kandahar that grounded all air support, she was the last one standing, moving from man to man, keeping 17 critical casualties alive for 12 hours until evac could reach them. She saved my entire command staff that day. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. You mentioned her shaky hands, Doctor. That's nerve damage. She got it holding direct pressure on a young ranger's severed femoral artery for 6 straight hours on a mountainside, because she refused to let him bleed out. Her slow walk? That's from a shattered knee she got from a mortar blast while shielding a wounded soldier with her own body. The general raised the tablet. On the screen, crystal-clear security footage from Trauma Bay 1 was playing on a loop. It showed Sterling focusing on the abdomen. It showed Sarah pointing to the neck. It showed Sterling's vicious dismissal. It showed the monitor flatlining. It showed Sterling freezing in panic. And then it showed Sarah, moving like a blur, taking Sterling down with an expert block and plunging the needle into the commander's chest. It showed the immediate, miraculous result. A first-year combat medic in a muddy ditch would have spotted that tension pneumothorax, Doctor, the general said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You missed it. You were going to let one of my best men die because of your arrogance. When this woman, this hero, attempted to save his life, you obstructed her. And then you had her fired. Sterling crumpled. The veneer of the arrogant prince shattered completely, revealing the small, terrified man beneath. He started sweating profusely, his perfect hair now matted to his forehead. It was a high-stress situation. The protocols, he stammered, looking wildly around for help. He found none. Harold Pemberton, the administrator, was already pulling a pre-written letter from his jacket pocket, his face ashen. He practically sprinted to the podium. Dr. Sterling, he announced, his voice trembling but loud enough for every microphone to catch. Effective immediately, your privileges at Mercy General are suspended, pending a full federal investigation. He threw Sterling under the bus with the desperate speed of a man trying to outrun an explosion. 2 men in dark suits, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, now stepped forward, flanking Sterling. Federal agents. Preston Sterling, one said calmly, you're under investigation for felony insurance fraud, malpractice, and lying to federal officers. The senator's son looked utterly broken. His family connections, his powerful name, were useless against the full, righteous weight of the United States military and the Department of Justice. The cameras flashed, capturing his complete and total humiliation. Then, a final, perfect act of karmic justice. Big Mike, the security guard, stepped through the crowd. In his hands he held a single empty cardboard box. He walked right up to the stunned, sweating doctor and held it out. I believe you know the way out, Dr. Sterling, Mike said, his voice flat and heavy with grim satisfaction. Here's a box for your things. It's a bit small, but I think you'll manage. 1 year later, the sun shone brightly on the newly christened Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller Center for Trauma and Emergency Medicine. The name was a compromise. Sarah had refused to have it named after her until the board agreed to include emergency medicine, a nod to the entire team. The crowd at the dedication ceremony was a mix of hospital staff, city officials, and military brass. General Thompson sat in the front row, his cane resting against his chair, a proud smile on his face. Beside him sat Navy SEAL Commander Phillips, looking healthy and strong, a faint scar on his neck the only visible reminder of his brush with death. The new chief of surgery, a humble, brilliant woman from Johns Hopkins, watched from the side, a look of deep respect on her face. The entire nursing staff of Mercy General stood together, their posture different now. They stood taller, their voices a little louder, the fear gone from their eyes. Sarah, now the Director of Patient Care and Safety, stood at the podium. She hadn't wanted the title, but the position came with the authority to completely overhaul the hospital's protocols. She'd instituted a new rule, now being adopted by hospitals nationwide, known informally as Dusty's Law, which legally protected any medical professional who broke protocol in a good faith effort to save a patient's life. Mortality rates in the ER had dropped by 15% in 6 months. She kept her speech short. "A title on a door doesn't give you power," she said, her raspy voice carrying over the crowd. "The trust of your patient gives you power. Authority isn't granted by a board, it's earned in the trenches. This center is named after a nurse not because of one person, but as a promise. A promise that from this day forward, in this hospital, the patient will always come first. Always." After the applause died down, a young nurse, barely out of school, approached her nervously. She looked a lot like Brittany Moore had a year ago. Director Miller," she stammered. I'm new here. I get nervous. What if I see something and I'm not sure?" Sarah looked at the young woman and saw a reflection of 1,000 young medics she had trained over the years, full of fear and potential. She put a hand on her shoulder, her own hand steady now. "You speak up," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "You trust your gut, and you protect your patient. Don't worry, I have your back." As the young nurse walked away with a newfound confidence, Sarah watched her go, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. The ghosts of war were finally quiet. She was no longer a ghost in the hallways. She was a guardian. She was home. And that is the incredible true story of Sarah Miller. It's crazy to think that she was fired for saving a life just minutes before a 4-star general needed her to do exactly that. It really makes you wonder how many heroes are out there right now, getting punished for doing the right thing just because it breaks a protocol. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more real-life dramas about heroes getting the justice they deserve, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below telling me what you think should have happened to Dr. Sterling. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.